You'd have thought they'd have learned, wouldn't you? But they haven't. So Labour's at it again. This time it's we've had welfare, we've had pensioners, we've had farmers. Now we are targeting children with special educational needs and disabilities. And the next revolt has already started, with Labour MPs saying the due diligence hasn't been carried out in the plans to scrap EHCPs. And they're seriously concerned that this will leave disabled children and children needing extra support out in the cold. Now, this comes as no surprise to those of you who follow these vlogs and who know my skin in the game with education. We've been talking about this for a long time. We have been saying for a long time that Bridget Philipson's VAT on education policy only harms the most vulnerable in society. We've also been saying that the Education and Wellbeing Bill does exactly the same. It harms the most vulnerable, and now we're actively harming the most vulnerable. I remind you something that Bridget Philipson said yesterday in response to the welfare bill. She said, "We pushed ahead too fast. We didn't listen enough to people, including lots of people who had concerns about the nature of that change." Yet here we are again. We're doing exactly the same. We're pushing on too hard. We're creating mass insecurity in the sector by neither confirming nor denying what we're going to do with the EHCPs. Now, in a rare moment of, oh my goodness, where I do agree with Bridget Philipson is the SEN platform needs completely overhauling, without a shadow of doubt. But that does not mean it needs rewriting, and it does not mean that all components are broken. A lot of it needs investment. And again, as a very pertinent post on X yesterday, David Lammy's just given £94 million to Syria. But here we are, unable to fund EHCPs for kids with special educational needs and disabilities. And Bridget will turn around and say, well, this is why we're putting VAT on education. This is why we're trying to raise £1.8 billion over the tenure of Parliament to put back into these schools. Well, there's so many holes in that, like my colander. The money's not going back into schools. The money's going to social housing. And there is no way near that amount of money being raised from VAT on education, because all the kids that they said weren't going to leave have left. So that means it's got down to net zero. But also, more importantly, the kids that are leaving have special educational needs. Now, they don't have EHCPs because they don't need it in the independent sector, but they do need it in the state sector. In the state sector at present, 600,000 children have an educational healthcare plan. Now, that's conservative. And I think those that need educational healthcare plans could easily top 1 million. But the local authorities have no money. They cannot implement them. They cannot give them. The backlog of needing one goes way further. I mean, I think it's 18 months minimum wait now, and that's before you're even in the process. So we know that it's not working, but we know that what it can provide does work. So the process is knackered, but the end result does work, and it is a bespoke plan for children which, if implemented, gives them access to the education that they deserve and need. So this is causing absolute uproar, and the problem with this one is if you dismantle this, it does dismantle VAT on education, and it does dismantle the Education and Wellbeing Bill, because all of them are intrinsically interlinked and you can't have one without the other. So effectively, it's a right royal mess, and it's got a lot of public high profile support on this, because there's a lot of people, a lot of neurodivergent people in the public eye who are saying, hang on a minute, you can't do that. That is wrong. And a lot of high profile neurodivergent people who have children who will be directly affected by this. Now, I've spoken to you about my own experience with having a neurodivergent child who cannot access state education. So at present, she's in the independent sector. If she weren't in the independent sector, she would be homeschooled. And again, all of the rules as to whether I could homeschool her are changing. I will put the links to all of these articles, by the way, so that you can read them on this video, and you can see exactly how they are changing. So the reason that she can't go to a mainstream setting is actually nothing to do with her academics. She's very academic, and she's learning really well. It's a sensory thing. It's her being able to access that education, and that comes from the actual environment itself. It comes from the building, it comes from the other kids that are there, it comes from the noises, it comes from the processing, it comes from the style of teaching. Now, I don't expect her to go into a state system and take away all the resources from another child that might need it, because we pay for her to go to the independent sector. So we're not costing the state a penny, yet we still pay our taxes. So we are still paying into the system that will hopefully help another child. But if we can't afford to do that, then she has to come out of the independent sector. And as we've just ascertained, she can't go into the state sector. So her choice for an education is homeschool or homeschool. And people say we're privileged. So if we have a look at what the MPs are saying, it's looking pretty miserable. And again, if you were in Labour at the minute, you really ought to be paying attention to this, because this is yet another example of how they're not listening to what you and I and the families are saying. A reduction or complete snatching away of EHCPs in mainstream education would mean that their needs magically vanish. It would instead increase applications for already overcrowded special schools, or would mean that they would be forced out of school altogether. Without statutory support underpinned by necessary extra resources for schools, it's extremely unlikely that ministers will achieve their aim of more children with SEND thriving or even surviving in mainstream education. So you've already had my example of how we wouldn't survive in mainstream education. We've acknowledged that. We haven't asked anyone else to pay for it. We haven't asked anyone else to do anything about it. We've done it ourselves. But there are hundreds of thousands of children who cannot do that, and this will affect them. There is no way that this cannot affect them. And then we look at these special educational schools, the specialist ones that, you know, we hear a lot about. These are niche schools with small numbers, and these are the private schools that Bridget Philipson talks about opening. So when she says to you, businesses close all the time in response to why private schools are closing, she'll say, well, that happens all the time. Private schools close every year, but private schools open every year. There's more private schools opening this year. And she's trying to say that VAT has had no bearing on private schools opening or closing. What she hasn't told you is that these independent schools, these private schools that are opening, are the special educational needs schools that are funded by the local authority, the taxpayer. And these schools are niche schools. So when you've got a school that's got 600 kids in it that closes, and that's in York, but you've got a niche school that takes 40 children that's opened in Scotland, how's that helping? It's not. So when you've got 3 independent schools in London closing and about 1,200, well, no more than that, probably 3,000 children needing a new school, and you've got a specialist educational school opening in Lincolnshire that will take 40 children, how is that helping? It's not. The funding is completely different. We are talking about mainstream independent schools closing and special educational needs schools opening. We are not talking like for like. So the whole thing is intrinsically linked. If you add VAT on education, it will negatively affect the SEND process. It will negatively affect the Education and Welfare Bill. So if you remove one, you effectively see the implosion of all of them, which is what everybody said would happen. It's what they were warned about. I mean, we heard in the court case that Rachel Reeves was explicitly warned about who this would affect, how negatively it would affect, and what demographic they would be. And it was the children with special educational needs, the disabled kids. She was told that this would negatively affect them. It would negatively affect their life choices outside of education. And she went ahead with it. Because to exempt them was, in the words of the government, administratively onerous. So we can only assume that it was administratively onerous to do any research into these bills. We can only assume it was administratively onerous to want to do the fact checking and the back checking and adding the numbers up and making sure that this worked. And that's why they didn't do it, which is why we find ourselves in the mess that we are in today, where Bridget Philipson talks about getting rid of EHCPs and we don't know what's going to replace them. And the ministers are saying there is no detail. There is absolutely no detail in what she's saying she wants to do. We are waiting for a white paper to be published in the autumn and we have no idea what's in it, which is normal behaviour from this government, that they just put it on the table and go, there you go, that's what you're having, with no discussion, with no debate, with no due diligence, with no risk assessment, with no assurances, with no detail. There is no plan for change. And that's their tagline. That's their actual tagline, their plan for change, but they haven't planned their plans. It's an absolute joke. And they wonder why we are the laughing stock of the world at the minute. They wonder why people are so vocally against the Labour government. It's absolutely no surprise that less people voted for Labour less people voted for them than didn't vote for them. So more people voted to not have a Labour government than voted to have a Labour government, but they cocked it up and they voted for too many splinter parties. What we've got now is a majority of a minority of people that have not thought this through. And it is looking like the implosion of the education system. And it is looking like the kids that are going to be hit the hardest are the special educational needs and disabled ones. And you tell me how that is going to look when it goes through Parliament. I predict right now another rebellion, and I hope another U-turn. But why do we keep having to get to this point where we U-turn, where we cost the economy more money? Why didn't we do the research at the beginning? I feel like a broken record because I keep saying it, but I never get any answers.